Standing at the altar in front of 200 guests, I watched my mother's hands tremble in her lap. My future mother-in-law had just taken the microphone, and with a smile sharp enough to cut glass, she called my mother a penniless country widow who should be grateful we even let her sit in the back row. The Carter family erupted into laughter. And to my absolute horror, my fiancé Daniel laughed right along with them. They thought my mother was weak. They thought I was some desperate nobody clawing my way into their wealth and their name. What they didn't know, what they never once bothered to find out, was who my mother really was, what I had spent nearly a decade building in uniform, and what was waiting for them the very next morning, in the form of a single signature that would end everything they had. My name is Claire Bennett. For most of my adult life, my world was built on three things: duty, discipline, and silence. I never talked about what I had, what I'd earned, or what I came from. I let people believe whatever they wanted to believe about me. That habit almost cost me everything. It also saved me. I met Daniel Carter about a year after I transitioned out of active duty. I'd spent nearly a decade overseas managing logistics operations. The unglamorous, invisible work of making sure fuel, food, medical supplies, and equipment moved exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there, across some of the most difficult terrain and dangerous conditions imaginable. It teaches you things that don't show up on a resume. It teaches you to read people quickly and accurately, because sometimes a bad read costs lives. It teaches you patience under pressure most people never have to experience. And it teaches you, above all else, that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one actually in control of anything. When I came home, I wanted something quiet, something ordinary. I wanted to sit in a coffee shop without instinctively scanning the exits. I wanted to fall asleep without a mission schedule dictating exactly when. I wanted, for the first time in a long time, to simply be a woman named Claire, with no rank attached to her name. And for a while, Daniel gave me exactly that. He was charming in that effortless way that only comes from never once having to try. Old money does that to people. It smooths every rough edge before life ever gets the chance to put one there. He had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room, of remembering small details you'd mentioned once in passing weeks earlier, of showing up with exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. He sent flowers on the anniversary of my father's death without me ever telling him the date. I later found out he'd asked my mother privately, which at the time struck me as thoughtful. Looking back, it strikes me differently. He'd had a lifetime of practice reading a room and giving it what it wanted to see. I never told him about my medals, tucked away in a drawer I rarely opened. I never mentioned the acreage my family quietly held out in the valley, land that had been in my father's name since before I was born, and in my mother's name ever since. It wasn't a secret so much as it was simply irrelevant to me. I had never once needed my worth measured in dollars or decorations, and frankly, the world had already tried to measure me that way enough times in uniform. To Daniel, and to everyone in his circle, I was just an ordinary woman. A veteran, sure, that made for good dinner party conversation, a story he could tell about his interesting fiancé, but fundamentally ordinary. Raised by a single widow named Evelyn, who lived modestly on what they assumed was some sleepy little homestead out past the highway exit nobody used. They had no idea. My mother had sacrificed everything after my father died. She raised me on her own, working with hands that never stopped moving, sending me to school, to college, into the service, without ever once asking for anything back. She never dated again, never remarried, never even really let herself rest, not properly, not the way she deserved to. She poured every ounce of herself into making sure I had a future worth having, and she did it so quietly that most people who met her assumed her life had simply always been small. It wasn't small. It was enormous, in every way that actually matters. If there is one person on this earth I would burn my whole life down to protect, it's her. I loved Daniel. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story about a woman who never cared or who saw through him from the very first date. I didn't. I fell for him the way most people fall for things, slowly and then all at once. But almost from the beginning, I noticed the way his family sized people up. Not by what was in their character, not by what they'd sacrificed or built or survived, but by what school crest was stitched on their blazer, what neighborhood their mailing address sat in, what club their name appeared on the roster of. I told myself Daniel was different. I told myself that a man who held my hand so gently, who spoke so warmly about building a life together, couldn't possibly share his mother's rot. My oldest friend from the service, a woman named Priya who had served 2 tours alongside me and had an unnerving talent for reading people under pressure, met Daniel exactly once before the engagement. Afterward, over coffee, she asked me carefully whether I'd ever seen him disagree with his mother about anything, even something small. I laughed it off at the time. I couldn't actually think of an example. I told myself that just meant they got along well. Priya didn't say anything else about it. She didn't need to. I understood the question long before I understood why she'd asked it. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a relationship once you've decided not to see something. I lived in that quiet for the better part of a year, telling myself it was patience, telling myself it was love, telling myself that people don't have to be perfect for a relationship to be right. All of that is true in the abstract. But there's a difference between accepting someone's imperfections and slowly, carefully training yourself to stop noticing the moments that should actually matter. I didn't recognize the difference then. I recognize it now. I was about to learn exactly how wrong I'd been to laugh it off. The cracks started showing the moment Daniel introduced me to his mother, Victoria Carter. Our first dinner together was at their private club, the kind of place with a 2-year waiting list and a dress code stricter than some military inspections I'd been through. Victoria arrived in a gown that probably cost more than my mother's first car, dripping in the kind of understated jewelry that only looks understated if you already know exactly what it costs. From the second she looked at me, I watched her calculating, the way an assessor walks a property she's already decided to reject, just going through the motions of the inspection for appearance's sake. She was polite to my face, in the particular way people are polite when they've already decided you don't matter enough to be openly rude to. But the comments came anyway, small and precise, arriving like paper cuts you don't notice until you're bleeding. She asked, with theatrical innocence, whether my mother had ever been to a real city. She wondered aloud, to no one in particular, whether people from those kinds of towns understood proper table settings, and then demonstrated, unprompted, which fork was for which course, as though I hadn't spent a decade eating in officers' messes on 4 continents. When my mother wore a simple, tasteful Sunday dress to a Carter family gathering, Victoria's eyes swept over it once, top to bottom, and she said, loudly enough for half the room to hear, that it was refreshing to see someone embrace such practical fashion. My mother, ever the picture of quiet dignity, simply smiled and let it slide off her like rain off a coat. She had weathered worse than Victoria Carter. She had buried a husband in her 30s and raised a daughter alone in a house with a leaking roof. She'd learned to patch herself and built something out of nothing through sheer, unglamorous will. A rich woman's condescension didn't even register on her as a real threat, but it registered on me. I filed away every single comment, every single slight, the way I'd once logged discrepancies in a supply manifest, not with anger yet, just with meticulous, patient attention. When wedding planning officially began, Victoria's condescension curdled into outright control. She commandeered every decision, the venue, the florist, the guest list, the catering, even the calligraphy on the invitations, under the polite fiction of helping, though what she was actually doing was constructing a spectacle engineered entirely to impress her business associates and social circle. My mother was systematically excluded from every meaningful choice. Victoria would forget to invite her to tastings, and then apologize with a laugh that never quite reached her eyes. She'd schedule fittings during hours she knew my mother was working. At my own bridal shower, thrown at Victoria's insistence at a venue my mother could never have afforded to reciprocate, Victoria stood up mid-toast and joked, to a ripple of polite laughter, that she hoped my mother would enjoy seeing how the other half lives, if only for an afternoon. My mother laughed along, because that's what you do when the alternative is making a scene at your own daughter's shower. I did not laugh. I remember gripping the stem of my champagne glass hard enough that my knuckles went pale. Every single time I brought this to Daniel, every slight, every calculated cruelty dressed up as a joke, I got the same response: a tired sigh, a placating hand. On my shoulder, some version of, "Claire, that's just how my mother is. Let it go. Once we're married, none of this will matter." But it did matter. It mattered enormously. because what Daniel didn't understand, or maybe understood perfectly well and simply didn't want to face, was that he wasn't keeping the peace by staying silent. He was choosing a side, quietly, one small surrender at a time. Every time he let his mother's cruelty slide, he was telling me, without ever having to say it outright, exactly where his loyalty would land the moment it truly mattered. I heard that message loud and clear, over and over, for the better part of a year. I just refused to believe it, because believing it meant admitting the wedding I'd already half-planned in my head was a mistake. I should have listened to that a lot sooner than I did. The day arrived wrapped in a suffocating kind of grandeur. Over 200 guests filled the manicured courtyard of the Carter estate: judges, corporate executives, socialites in designer gowns and tailored suits, the kind of crowd that exists to be seen at things more than to actually celebrate anything. A string quartet played in the corner. Ice sculptures melted slowly under strands of warm white lights. Waitstaff in black tie circulated with trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's rent. It looked less like a wedding and more like a shareholder gala that happened to have a bride standing somewhere in the middle of it. I remember getting ready that morning with a strange, hollow calm settling over me, the kind of calm I used to feel in the hours before a difficult deployment briefing. My mother helped me into my dress with hands that shook slightly, and I told her it was just nerves. I think some part of both of us already knew it wasn't. My mother sat in the fourth row, in a modest navy dress she had pressed herself the night before. In the small kitchen of the house, she still refused to leave despite everything the land underneath it had become worth. She looked radiant in a way none of the diamonds in that courtyard could touch. The quiet, grounded pride of a woman who had earned every single thing she had, sitting calmly among people who had inherited theirs and never once had to wonder if it might disappear. I remember standing at the top of the aisle, veil catching the afternoon light, feeling that strange mixture of hope and dread that I now recognize as my body trying to warn me about something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. Just before the officiant called us to our places, Victoria tapped a champagne flute with a spoon and stepped up to the ceremonial microphone. She said she wanted to offer a small blessing before the vows began. A sweet gesture, everyone around me assumed, smiling and settling in. The moment she opened her mouth, the tone in that courtyard shifted from celebration to something colder. "Before Daniel takes this step," Victoria announced, her voice carrying crisp and clear over the sound system, practiced, unhurried, "I think it's only right to acknowledge just how generous this family is being today." She paused for effect, the way people do when they already know exactly what damage they're about to cause and want to savor the anticipation of it. "We are graciously opening our home to a penniless country widow who should be deeply grateful we're even letting her sit among us." A gasp rippled through the crowd. And then, laughter. Quiet, ugly, malicious laughter from the front rows, the kind that spreads not because it's actually funny, but because nobody wants to be the only person not in on the joke. I watched my mother's chin tremble. I watched her knuckles go white around the clasp of her small handbag as she fought back tears in front of 200 strangers who had done absolutely nothing to earn the right to witness her pain, and who were about to lose that right permanently. I turned to Daniel. I expected fury. I expected him to grab that microphone out of his mother's hands and shut this down before it went any further, before another second passed. Instead, I watched him glance down at his shoes. I watched a small, nervous smirk cross his face, the exact same smirk of a boy who has spent his entire life letting his mother win because it's always been easier than fighting her, dressed up now in a tuxedo and standing at his own wedding. That smirk broke something in me that I don't think will ever fully put itself back together. In that one unforgivable second, the man I thought I loved simply vanished. What stood there instead was a stranger in an expensive suit, too much of a coward to protect the person who had raised me, on the single day he was supposed to be standing beside me for exactly that. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I walked forward, calm as still water, the same calm I'd carried through far more dangerous rooms than this one, and I pulled the microphone directly out of Victoria's hands. The scree. Edge of feedback cut across the courtyard like a gunshot, and just like that, 200 people went dead silent. I looked out at all those staring faces, and I spoke in the same voice I'd once used to give orders in situations far more dangerous than a garden wedding. Steady, level, unshakable. The only person in this courtyard lacking dignity, class, and basic human decency, I said, is the woman who just spoke, and the man standing beside me who laughed along with her. Daniel's face went crimson. Claire, stop making a scene. Hand back the mic, take your place. I didn't. I slid the engagement ring off my finger and dropped it into the front pocket of his tuxedo jacket. There will be no wedding today, Daniel, I told him. Not now, not ever. I unpinned my veil and let it fall onto the aisle runner behind me. Then I walked past the stunned faces, past the ice sculptures, past the string quartet that had gone completely silent mid-note, straight to the fourth row, where I reached for my mother's trembling hand and helped her to her feet. Arm in arm, we walked down that aisle together, out of that courtyard, out of that family, and though neither of us knew it yet, straight into the moment that would end the Carter empire for good. Behind us, I heard Victoria shrieking that I was having some kind of breakdown, that I'd come crawling back the second I realized what I'd thrown away. She genuinely believed I was the one leaving with nothing. Somewhere behind her, I could hear scattered whispers already starting, the kind that would be halfway across the city by dinner. She had no idea what was coming. Here is what Victoria Carter never took the time to find out about the penniless country widow she mocked in front of 200 people, or about the daughter standing beside her. My years in the military weren't spent in some minor desk role, filing paperwork in a quiet office somewhere safe. I ran large-scale logistics and supply chain operations across multiple international deployments, coordinating fuel, freight, and infrastructure movement worth tens of millions of dollars, under conditions that left absolutely no room for error, where a single miscalculation could cost equipment, missions, or lives. When I came home, I didn't just bring back medals and memories folded into a box in my closet. I brought back capital, discipline, and a skill set that translates directly, and very profitably, into the commercial world. The ability to see an entire system at once, find its weak point, and act on it without hesitation. My mother was never the fragile, penniless widow Victoria pictured when she looked at her navy Sunday dress and decided she already knew everything worth knowing. Decades before the city's industrial sprawl ever crept out that far, my father had quietly purchased hundreds of acres of flat, buildable land bordering the region's major rail lines and freight corridors. Land that at the time, absolutely nobody wanted, considered too far out, too undeveloped, not worth the taxes. When he passed away unexpectedly, my mother refused every single offer to sell it off, even in the hard years when selling would have made her life considerably easier. She kept every acre in the family, living simply and without pretension entirely by choice, while slowly leasing sections of that land to agricultural, and eventually, industrial developers as the region grew outward around her. Over the following 2 decades, that quiet, unassuming stretch of land my mother refused to sell became one of the most valuable commercial corridors in the entire state. And its single largest tenant, Carter Global Logistics, the very same multi-million-dollar shipping company that funded Victoria's wardrobe, Daniel's sports car collection, and the sprawling estate where they had just staged their cruel little spectacle in front of 200 witnesses. The Carter family's entire primary distribution hub, a 60-acre complex housing their central warehouses and administrative headquarters, the operational heart of their entire business, sat on a long-term commercial land lease owned exclusively by Bennett Holdings. That lease had been structured by my mother years earlier, with the quiet, careful precision of a woman who never trusted anyone else to protect what she'd built, and was managed through my own legal counsel. It carried strict conduct clauses, community standing provisions, and a rapidly approaching renewal deadline requiring my sole signature as majority trustee of the estate. They had built an empire on ground they never legally controlled, standing on land whose true owner they'd spent years quietly humiliating without ever once bothering to ask her name properly. And they had just spent an entire wedding making a spectacle of the 2 women who did control it. Less than an hour after walking out of that courtyard, I was sitting in the downtown office of my corporate attorney, Nathan Hayes, still in my wedding dress, my mother resting quietly in the next room with a cup of tea someone had brought her, her hands finally steady again, now that the eyes of 200 strangers were no longer on her. Nathan reviewed the lease documents laid out across his desk, the same documents he had helped my mother draft years earlier, back when nobody outside our family had any idea how valuable that land would eventually become. The lease was set to expire at the end of the current quarter. The renewal clause was non-transferable and entirely discretionary, meaning it required, in plain and binding language, my mother's and my direct, willing approval to continue for even one additional term. They genuinely have no idea who owns the ground under their feet, do they? Nathan asked, looking up at me with something between disbelief and grim satisfaction, the same look he'd worn years earlier when my mother first walked into his office with a stack of old deeds, and a plan nobody thought a widow from a small town would actually carry through. None at all, I said. It's time we sent formal notice. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Daniel's entire world came apart. His phone lit up with frantic, back-to-back calls from Carter Global Logistics' chief operating officer and half the board of directors, none of whom had any idea what was happening, only that something catastrophic had landed on the company's front desk overnight. A formal legal notice had been delivered before sunrise. Their 30-year commercial land lease would not be renewed. They had exactly 60 days to fully vacate a 60-acre distribution hub, responsible for the movement of nearly their entire freight network. For a company that size, that kind of relocation on that kind of timeline wasn't an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe with a countdown clock attached to it. Broken client contracts triggering penalty fees. Operational paralysis as warehouses sat unmovable. Vendors pulling out ahead of the chaos. Investors panicking and demanding answers nobody could give them. The kind of financial freefall that takes decades of carefully built reputation and unwinds it in a matter of weeks, sometimes days. Panicked and humiliated, Daniel and Victoria demanded an emergency meeting with the landowner, someone whose identity, buried behind layers of holding companies and legal representation my mother had insisted on structuring years earlier for exactly this kind of protection, they hadn't yet managed to uncover. They stormed into the offices of Hayes and Associates, expecting to find some ruthless corporate landlord they could threaten, negotiate with, or simply intimidate into quietly backing down the way they'd always managed to intimidate people before. Instead, when the heavy conference room doors swung open, Victoria froze mid-sentence, her mouth still open around whatever demand she'd been rehearsing on the elevator ride up. Sitting at the head of the table, flanked by legal counsel and a stack of fully executed documents, was my mother. Evelyn Bennett, dressed in a crisp, elegant suit that fit her like it had always belonged to her, calmly sipping tea, radiating the kind of quiet authority that money can never actually buy no matter how much of it you have. Beside her sat me, with the signed non-renewal notice laid neatly in front of me, next to a folder Victoria would recognize soon enough as containing every single email, every scheduling exclusion, every documented slight from the last 18 months. Daniel went pale. His briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a dull, echoing thud that seemed to last far longer than it should have. "Claire," he stammered, what is this, some kind of joke?" "This isn't a joke, Daniel," I said, letting each word land with the full weight it deserved. "The way you deliver news you know is about to change someone's entire life. This is Bennett Holdings. The penniless country widow you and your mother humiliated in front of 200 guests yesterday is the sole owner of the land your family's entire business has operated on for the last several decades. And I am the managing director who personally signed your non-renewal notice this morning." Victoria's face went from fury to disbelief to sheer terror in the space of about 10 seconds, as it finally, fully sank in that the cruelty they'd treated as entertainment the day before had just detonated their entire generational fortune, live, in front of the very woman they'd humiliated for it. What followed wasn't quick, and it wasn't quiet. Within a matter of months, Carter Global Logistics collapsed under the combined weight of breached shipping contracts, catastrophic relocation costs, and the kind of reputational damage no public relations firm on earth could spin their way out of. Clients fled to competitors who could actually guarantee stability. Investors pulled funding one by one. The board, in a final act of self-preservation, orked out the very leadership that had let arrogance and carelessness sink a company 3 generations in the building. The story didn't stay quiet, either. In a social circle as small and gossip-hungry as theirs, Word of exactly why the Carters lost their headquarters spread fast, and it spread with the wedding attached to it. The same guests who had laughed along in that courtyard suddenly found themselves retelling the story in a very different tone at their own dinner tables. Less, did you hear what she did? More, did you hear what they did to deserve it? Victoria was ultimately forced to auction off the estate itself, the same manicured courtyard where she had once stood, microphone in hand, mocking a woman she assumed had nothing left to lose. Daniel, stripped of the unearned confidence that had carried him his entire life without him ever once having to build anything of his own, ended up taking a low-level dispatch position with a logistics company across the country, about as far from his old life as geography allowed. I heard, secondhand, that he never quite figured out how to explain any of it to the people he worked with now. I won't pretend there's no satisfaction in watching cruelty meet consequence. There is. I'm human, and I'm not going to sit here and claim I felt nothing watching an empire built on mockery come apart at the seams. But that was never really the point of any of this, and it never should be the point for anyone. The point was my mother. My mother and I didn't sell that land once the lease ended, even though we could have, even though plenty of developers came calling with numbers big enough to make most people's heads spin. Instead, we repurposed the site entirely, transforming it into the home of the Bennett Foundation, a nonprofit organization providing job training, transitional housing grants, and business mentorship for military veterans and single mothers rebuilding their lives from the ground up, the exact same way my mother once quietly rebuilt hers, without anyone clapping for her, without anyone even noticing. It felt right. It felt like turning a place that had once been the stage for someone else's careless cruelty into something that could actually help people who needed it. In the weeks that followed, my phone did not stop. Some of it was exactly what you'd expect reporters from local business outlets who'd caught wind of the lease story and wanted to quote distant acquaintances, suddenly remembering they'd always thought Daniel seemed a bit much. People I hadn't spoken to in years reaching out with a strange mixture of concern and thinly disguised curiosity. I let most of it go to voicemail. I wasn't interested in turning my mother's pain into a headline, even a flattering one. Daniel texted more than once. The first message was an apology, the kind that spends 3 sentences explaining his own feelings before finally, almost as an afterthought, mentioning my mother's name. The second, a week later, was angrier, accusing me of destroying his family out of spite, as though refusing to renew a lease on my own land was some kind of personal vendetta, rather than simply the natural, predictable consequence of the way his family had chosen to treat 2 people who had never done anything but show up with grace, again and again, and get mocked for it. The third message, a month after that, was quieter. He said he understood, finally, why I'd walked away. He said his mother had never let him disagree with her about anything, not once, not even as a grown man, and that watching everything collapse had been the first time in his life he'd truly seen what that cost him. I believed him, actually. I still didn't respond. Understanding something after the damage is done doesn't undo the damage, and it doesn't put my mother's dignity back in that courtyard where it belonged. Priya called the morning the story broke locally, laughing so hard on the phone she could barely get words out. I asked you one question, she said, one question about whether he'd ever disagreed with his mother, and you went and became the plot of a movie. I told her she'd been right to ask it. She told me she already knew that. That's the thing about people who actually know you, they don't say, "I told you so," with any real malice in it. They just want to make sure you're okay, and then they let you laugh about it later, once the worst of it has passed. My mother, for her part, handled the entire aftermath with the same quiet grace she'd handled everything else in her life. She never once gloated. When a local reporter asked her how it felt to watch the Carter empire crumble, she simply said that she hoped Daniel and Victoria found their way to becoming better people, because carrying that much bitterness around for a lifetime sounded exhausting, and she'd rather spend her remaining years building something than resenting anyone. I remember standing beside her when she said it, and thinking that this exact response was the entire reason I'd walked out of that wedding in the first place. Not for revenge, for her, for the woman who could stand in the wreckage of someone else's cruelty and still choose grace over bitterness, every single time. People sometimes ask me if I regret how publicly it all played out, pulling the microphone, dropping the ring in front of 200 guests, walking out mid-ceremony instead of quietly calling things off somewhere private, later, away from all those staring eyes. I don't. Not for 1 second. My mother spent her entire life absorbing other people's cruelty in silence so that I would never have to. The very least I could do, the one time it truly mattered most, was refuse to let her absorb it alone, in front of everyone, without anyone standing beside her. I think about that fourth row a lot. I think about her hands shaking around that small handbag and the way she still, even in that moment, tried to protect me from seeing how much it hurt. I think about how easy it would have been for her to raise me bitter, to raise me resentful of people who had more than we did. She never did that. She raised me to notice cruelty, to remember it clearly, and to never, ever laugh along with it. Which is, I think, the exact opposite of what Daniel's mother ever taught him. I think, too, about how close I came to letting it all slide, the way Daniel always asked me to. There were dozens of moments in that engagement where the easier path was simply to swallow it. One more comment, one more slight, one more excuse made on Daniel's behalf, until eventually silence became the shape of our entire relationship. I understand now how people end up spending decades inside marriages built on exactly that kind of silence, telling themselves it's not worth the conflict, that things will get better once the wedding is over, once the in-laws warm up, once. They rarely do. Cruelty tolerated quietly in the name of keeping the peace doesn't disappear once the ring is on your finger. It just learns that it's allowed to stay. What I want people to take from this isn't really the lease, or the 60 days, or the collapse of a company that built its identity on looking down at people who worked with their hands. Those parts make for a satisfying story, and I won't pretend I don't understand why people love hearing them. But the actual lesson, the one that matters, is smaller and quieter than that. It's about the moment you decide that someone else's dignity is worth more to you than your own comfort. It's about choosing, in front of everyone, to stand next to the person who has never once asked anything of you except your loyalty, instead of the person who promised you a life you thought you wanted. My mother still lives in that same small house, on that same piece of land, even now, even with everything it's worth on paper. She says she's not interested in a bigger house at her age, that the house holds too many memories to leave, and I've stopped trying to talk her out of it. Some mornings I drive out to see her, and we sit on the same porch where she used to help me with homework after school, and neither of us mentions Daniel or Victoria or the wedding at all. There's nothing left to say about them. They were, in the end, a very small part of a very long story that was always really about her. So I'll leave you with the same question I've asked myself more times than I can count since that day. If you were standing at that altar, watching someone you loved humiliate the person who raised you, would you have walked out too? Would you have found the courage to hand back the ring, in front of everyone, knowing exactly how much you were choosing to lose? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you even a little, make sure to subscribe, because there are plenty more stories just like it waiting for you, stories about the quiet people who turn out to be far stronger than anyone standing in that courtyard ever gave them credit for.